So David has gone the way of all the earth. But as we saw in some of the Psalms, as well as in the stories about David, there is this hope, maybe by the author who's writing the stories, but also in David himself. He has hope that someone greater than himself will come. And he's got a promise too. When he goes to his death, he knows God has promised, covenanted to him to put his son Solomon on the throne and to establish the throne of David's kingdom forever. So when we come to 1 Kings chapter 2 and we read in verse 12, so Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. We're seeing the fulfillment, at least initially, right, of the covenant that God made with David. And then 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 46, the very last line of 1 Kings chapter 2, the author says it again. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. So now all of our hope is in Solomon. We had such great hope for David, and he delivered in many ways, but in the end, he was not the one who could save us, not the one who could destroy the works of the serpent, bring us back to the way things used to be. But we know where to look for that person. That person's going to come from the line of David. His son is going to sit on the throne, and God is going to be to David's son a father, and David's son will be to God as a son. And so we come into 1 Kings chapter 3, and you look at the beginning. Look at how it starts. It's an interesting start. It says, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. All right, a couple things about that. Do you think that's a good idea? For Solomon, the first thing it says, after the kingdom is established in his hand, to make a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now I think, and we're going to have to look at this later, I'm pretty sure God had already said through Moses, don't go down to Egypt and even buy horses or something like that. And now Solomon, in the first act that's being recorded, is making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, marrying his daughter so that they'll be able to have some sort of political partnership. Do you think that's a good idea? It's interesting that the author kind of introduces Solomon with this suspect act at best, right? And then it also tells us something about how no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. And what does that remind you of? That reminds you of the promise that God made to David, right? Do you remember when and why God made that promise to David? What was going on? What was happening? Remember how Nathan came and delivered the words to David that God's going to build you a house? But do you remember what was happening? David was sitting in his own house, and he was thinking about how he wanted to build God a house for the name of the Lord. And God told him, you're not going to do that. Your son will build a house for my name. And so the author is also telling us, not only is the kingdom established in the hands of Solomon, he's bringing it back to our attention. Remember, there is no house that's been built for the name of the Lord. Now, we might feel a little bit uneasy about Solomon because of the marriage alliance, but look at chapter 3, verse 3 of 1 Kings. And look what it says. Solomon loved the Lord. The Lord loved Solomon. This is said, I think, back around the birth of Solomon. And Solomon loved the Lord. He walked in the statutes of David, his father. He listened to his father's last words, which were to walk in the statutes, in the rules, in the laws of Moses that God has given us. And the author wants you to know that at the very beginning, Solomon loved the God of Israel. He loved Yahweh. And he walked in obedience to what Yahweh said. Now, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. Now, has this been happening lately? That God is appearing in a dream and speaking directly to someone? I mean, God is treating Solomon in a special way here. Showing up and talking directly to Solomon. He's treating him maybe like a son. And what happens in the dream? 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. Look at the last line. It says, God says to Solomon, this is what you dream, right? Ask what I shall give you. I mean, what's God saying? Solomon, ask me for whatever you want. What would you ask for? What do you think you would ask God for? We're going to learn something about what's in the heart of Solomon, right? I mean, God opens up the door and says, ask me for whatever you want. And what does Solomon say? Look at 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 7. So now, even back in verse 6, Solomon says, you've shown great and steadfast love to your servant David. You've kept for him steadfast love. You've given him a son to sit on the throne. Verse 7. And now, O Lord my God, you've made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. I mean, David had a huge kingdom. And what Solomon's saying, God says, ask me whatever you want. Solomon's a young man, and he says, oh Lord, I don't know how to lead this people. Your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you've chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered. Verse 9, here's what I'd ask for. Lord, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who's able to govern this, your great people? Remember, David in his last words was thinking about how beautiful it is when God's people are ruled by a righteous king. And what does Solomon ask the Lord for when he could ask for anything? He says, oh Lord, I don't know how to lead this people. Give me an understanding mind so I can know right from wrong, so that I can lead your people, Lord. What do you think God thought about that request? Look at verse 10. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. I remember a story of David where he did some horrible things and said this displeased the Lord. And now David's son, though, is on the throne, and God's given him right at the beginning the chance to ask for anything. And what he asks for pleased the Lord. And look at what God says. Verse 11. Because you've asked this, Solomon, and haven't asked for the kinds of things that everyone else would ask for, like long life, riches, but because you asked for understanding to discern what is right. Behold, this is in verse 12. I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. Do you get that? God says, I'm going to do it. I'm not just going to give you a wise and understanding heart. I'm going to make you the wisest man that has ever lived on the face of the earth. And I'm going to give you, in verse 13, also what you didn't ask for. I'm going to give you riches and honor, so that no other king will compare with you all your days. So I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for, because you asked for the right thing. You asked me for wisdom to how to rule my people. God is just showering the blessings on Solomon. But look at verse 14. He says, and if you will walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And that's the first time that you see something like that to Solomon. We know God's committed to him. But God also says, if you will keep walking in my ways, then I'll grant you long life, and you'll have a prosperous reign. Now, think about this. God has just promised Solomon, a very young man, that he's going to be the wisest man who's ever been, who's ever lived. As you hear that, like, what do you want to know? Did that actually happen? I mean, how would you even know if Solomon got that kind of wisdom? I mean, you can say you're going to make him the wisest man on the earth, but what would you need? What would you want to see? You'd want to see some evidence, right? And so the very next thing that the author does is he tells his story about two women, prostitutes actually, who both had baby boys. And in the night, one of them rolled over, smothered the baby boy, and killed him. She wakes up, she finds what she did. She takes her child and she switches it with the other lady's child, the one that's still alive. Next morning, the other lady wakes up and she sees her child's dead. She looks closely at it and she realizes, this isn't my child. She puts together what's happened, okay? But the other lady, the first lady who has accidentally killed her child, says, no, that's not right. This is my child. They both come to Solomon and they say, hey, this is what happened. And they both say, the living child is my child. The dead child is the other lady's child. There's no way, right, to know. And what does Solomon do? He says, all right, I've got the solution. Bring me the child that's alive. And I can solve this. I'll just cut that child in two, and then each of you can have half. And everybody can walk away and be happy. And what happens? What do you think would happen? The woman who is not the mother of this child says, okay, that sounds reasonable. But the woman who is the true mother, what does she say? What do you think she'd say? Says, no. Just give this baby to the other woman. Why? Solomon knows, right? Because she's the real mother and she loves the child like a mother. And why does this storyteller tell us that story right after the dream where God tells Solomon, I'm going to make you the wisest man in the earth? It's so that you can see God's put his wisdom in Solomon to be able to discern things. And this story gets out. Verse 28 of chapter 3. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. And Solomon begins his reign in an amazing way. And I want you to look at 1 Kings chapter 4 as we finish out this study for this time. Look at verse 20. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. Have you heard anything like that before? And they ate and they drank in this land, and they were so happy. Solomon, verse 21, ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. Does that sound familiar? I mean, think about it. Offspring of Israel, like the sand on the sea, under a righteous king, and the people are happy in the land, serving under the righteous king. And how much land do they have? They have the land from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. What do you think that's about? What's the author trying to get you to see? And then it talks about all the wealth that Solomon has, all the safety that the people experience in verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all the famous people, just like God had promised he would do for him. And look at what happens. 1 Kings 4:34. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. He, the righteous king, governing over the land that God had promised with a happy, innumerable people, is being a blessing to all the families of the earth. And what do you think about this? Is that the fulfillment of what? Of the promises that God has been making, especially the promises that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15. I'll give you this land. I will bless you. I'll make your name great. I'll give you offspring like the sand on the seashore. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. It seems like all of God's promises are coming to pass through the Son of David, someone that God loves like a son, someone that seems to love God like a father. And we think this is the man through whom God is going to rescue the world.